It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Tocqueville lecture given by Professor Chandran Kukathas. The title of Professor Kukathas' talk is Immigration and Freedom. Professor Kukathas holds the chair of political theory in the Department of Government at London School of Economics. He has previously taught at the University of Utah and in Australia. He's the author of Hayek and Modern Liberalism, published by Oxford University Press in 1989, and most recently, The Liberal Archipelago, published by Oxford in 2003. Chandran has kindly agreed to come and talk to us about immigration. It's a subject that is the object of his forthcoming book, Immigration and Freedom, that will be published by Princeton in 2019. This is a very important topic for all of us, and especially for those who want to see whether and how the lessons of classical liberalism can be applied to the world today. I should point out that it's a topic especially important in the world that celebrates today 29 years from the fall of the Berlin Wall, that kind of unleashed all of the problems and the challenges that we have today. The world is totally different from the one before the fall of Berlin Wall 29 years today. The format will be the regular format. Professor Kukathas will speak for about 40 minutes, something like this, and then we'll take question and answers. And I'd like to thank you for taking time. I'd like to remind the students in my class to sign on. There's a attendance circulating here. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Kukathas.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for hosting me, for coming, and thank you, Aurelian, for organizing this. So the theme of my talk today is Immigration and Freedom, as the title advertises. And let me say at the outset what the point is behind the topic itself. And it has to do with the fact that very often when people criticize or worry about immigration, particularly in the developed West, and I'm talking for the most part about liberal democracies, one of the concerns as voiced is that immigration is a worry, perhaps even a danger to some fundamental values, most notably the value of freedom, which is something that is particularly prized in liberal democracies. And what I want to say is that, yes, it's true, this is a serious concern, but the concern is really not immigration itself so much as immigration control. And this is the take-home message of the talk, that it's immigration control that we need to worry about rather than immigration itself, or more so than immigration itself, because it is immigration control that is the greater danger to freedom, and more broadly to certain important liberal democratic values, which I will speak about in the course of the presentation. Most notable among these is, of course, the value of equality. And I'm going to ask you to think about this from the beginning with this particular aphorism in mind from Max Frisch, who wrote very perceptively that we wanted workers, but we got people instead. This is a line that's also been taken by George Borjas in his most recent book called We Wanted Workers. Borjas is a very famous labor economist who's written extensively on immigration and the economics of immigration in particular, and he's made this the theme for his thinking about this. And I want to suggest that this is in fact a very prescient observation, but I want to turn it around slightly in ways that I think you'll detect once I start outlining the talk. Now, I'm going to present the talk in the following way. I'm going to actually start doing something which I think is not often done in discussions, presentations about immigration, which is starting with the issue of definition. From there, I will go on to say something about the main thesis of my presentation, which is that immigration control is a concern because it's a danger to freedom. And I'll go on from this to elaborate by suggesting that it's also a concern from the perspective of a worry about equality and the rule of law. And that will take up most of my presentation. that's to advance the positive thesis. In the second part of the shorter part of the presentation, I'll consider some objections to the point of view I'm developing. That is to say, maybe all the concerns I'm expressing are serious concerns, but maybe nonetheless there are considerations that suggest that we should not take them as seriously as I'm suggesting. One would be to say, well, there are economic benefits from immigration control. Another would be to say that there are cultural benefits. And a third would be to say that there are consequences that are important, that are worth considering in terms of self-determination. And these also negate the concern that we have about the negative impact of immigration control. And I'll try to say something about each of these counter-arguments and why ultimately I find them unconvincing. So let me turn then first to the issue of definition. And I want to say at the outset that this is something that I think most people haven't spent very much time on, but it's really a kind of fundamental issue, because the definition of immigration is actually quite a difficult matter. For that matter, the definition of immigrant is something that is much more controversial than we've recognized. What, after all, is an immigrant? Because an immigrant is not a natural kind. It's not as if you can go out there and see what an immigrant is. I can't tell who among you is an immigrant, although I know, Aurelian is one. I am certainly one, but one can't tell. For researchers, most of them adopt the UN definition, which says that an immigrant is a person outside his or her country of nationality for a year or longer. So the British government's very worried about immigration and immigration numbers. Here's a way to solve that problem. Let's make the definition you're an immigrant if you're outside your country of origin for 2 years. Now you've dropped the immigration numbers considerably. Of course, you could change it around and say, well, you're an immigrant if you're in the country for 6 months, and now you've got a crisis. Or you could say 2 days. Now, every tourist is an immigrant. So how do you, start thinking about the definition of an immigrant? I think this is actually much more important than people have recognized, because when they're talking about immigration control, they very often think that what's at issue is border control. But of course, it's not border control. People cross the borders all the time. About 70 million people cross the border, going in both directions every year, in and out of the United Kingdom. About 380 million people cross the US border every year in both directions. And that's without even including those who are so-called illegal immigrants. And it doesn't include the tens of thousands of, indeed hundreds of thousands of boats, planes, trucks that deliver goods or move across the border in this way. So immigration control is not really about border control. That's a very, very small part of it, even though it's what makes the news. Immigration control is really about what you can do once you've crossed the border. Can you stay? For how long? Can you get a job? Can you attend college? Can you get married? Can you rent a property? Can you open a bank account? This is what immigration control is really about. So in order to control immigration, what you've got to do is not just control the boundary crossing, you've got to control what it is that people can do. So that means what you've got to do is you've got to come up with a definition of the kinds of people for whom this kind of control is relevant. Who is the subject of immigration control? And one of the things I'm going to try to persuade you of is that this is a tricky problem because we can't identify immigrants just by looking at them. We have to have an institutional structure in order to do so. And this structure is going to be a very, very deep one, which then identifies different people, categorizes them in different ways, and says who is subject to which laws for what reasons, and so on. So in a kind of perverse way, the politics of immigration is really all about the politics of identity, not in the way that people think. but in the sense that you'll have to identify people as immigrants or non-immigrants. Now, there is another side to this as well. If it's difficult to identify an immigrant just by looking, so is it difficult to identify a national. A national is not a natural kind either. Who holds nationality of any particular country? This is also a matter of definition. And I want to, in a sense, remind you, because I'm sure it makes obvious sense as soon as I say it, that the definition of a person's nationality, or the determination of a person's nationality, is not a matter of discovering what is naturally so. It's a matter of determining, ultimately, legally and politically, who is or is not a national. Now, in the history of the determination of nationality in any particular country, the understanding of what is a national has varied enormously. Just to give you some examples, I can't give you a systematic account of this in the time available, but in the early 19th century, for example, or 20th century in the United States, if an American woman married a foreign national, she lost her American nationality. So the definition of nationality in the United States 100 years ago was such that you no longer were considered a national if you were married to the wrong person, if you were a woman. Now, this was changed later to make it a little bit easier on women. Then if they could retain their nationality provided they didn't marry the wrong kind of foreigner. If they married me, then that was going to be too bad. But if they married someone who was eligible for nationality, a white person, then it would be more likely that they would retain their nationality. But then this raises another kind of question. Well, what is a white person? In 1920, a Supreme Court case was one that determined a very, very fine question, whether someone from Syria was white. They found in favor of the Syrian. So if she'd married a Syrian, she would have retained her US nationality. But if she'd married someone, say, from Egypt, she would not have retained her nationality. I could go on with innumerable examples of this kind, but the main point is really quite straightforward. There's no natural definition of nationality. So nationality is a definition that's entirely legal and ultimately political. So here's the take-home message for this presentation. The first step in immigration control is not border control. It's not even control of what entitlements immigrants might have, or would-be immigrants might have. The first step is actually to define who is an immigrant and who is a national. You start by defining who is going to be considered, in a sense, one of us. And the history of immigration control really is, from the very beginning, a history of definitions. It's a history of deciding who is no longer going to be considered a part of this particular political community or political society. To give you one kind of example of this in a broader scale, think about the British Empire, which started to disintegrate after the end of the Second World War. But at this time, Britain did not have a category of citizens or citizenship. The Citizenship Act wasn't passed until 1948. So what was the status of all of the people in the British Empire, such as, for example, my parents? Well, they were British subjects, and they had the right to travel within this realm and go to Britain if they so wished. A good example of this is a guy called Freddie Mercury, who moved to Britain just, I think, in the late 40s or early 50s. He didn't immigrate, strictly speaking, because he was from Zanzibar. He moved there with his mother, moved to Britain with his mother, as someone who was simply entitled to abode in the United Kingdom. This is no longer the case for people from Zanzibar, because over the course of the next 60 years, British nationality law gradually changed to exclude more and more people from the category of those who could be identified as British subjects, or ultimately people who had rights of nationality. So immigration control over this period has not been a closing of the border in the sense of stopping people at the border and saying, no, we're not letting you in. It's a matter of deciding who is and is not a Briton. And Freddie Mercury was a Briton then, but if he were applying from Zanzibar now, he would not be. So again, my point is really quite a simple one, that immigration control begins not with border control, not with the determination of the rights of immigrants. It begins with the definition of an immigrant. Now, the broader question that I want to move to is, what does this mean for our freedom? Why is this a concern? Well, the most obvious reason is that it's quite possible for any one of us, even if we are here as citizens, to have our nationality brought into question. I mean, for one thing, is citizenship a part of being a national? An obvious question. Well, how do we establish what is the basis for citizenship? I understand at the moment the President of the United States is considering making birthright citizenship no longer a part of US practice. It's not practiced everywhere. The UK used to, but one of the things it did in the course of changing its nationality laws over the period since the breakup of the empire was to get rid of birthright citizenship. It affected one of my two children who was born in the UK. Had he been born a little bit earlier, he would be a UK citizen, but he's not. So there's nothing sacrosanct about birthright citizenship. It's just one form of citizenship you could recognize. So immigration control begins with definition. It begins with the definition not only of immigration, but of citizen or national, and it's all quite changeable. So if we're concerned about our freedom, if we're concerned about the kinds of institutions under which we live, if we're concerned about the values that underpin our society, one thing we ought to recognize is the way in which this might be affected is by the very, very definitions of our identity. Immigration control is not something that's directed simply and straightforwardly at outsiders. It's directed as much against insiders to the extent that from the very beginning, the whole issue is who is an insider and who is an outsider. And here we have lots of obvious problems. Who's to determine this? And in politics, we know that the outcomes here are not simply determined by anything so straightforward as even majority rule, which would still be problematic. It's determined by a whole host of institutional and political pressures. So this is really my first point, which leads me into the second, which is that the concern about immigration control is that ultimately it's control not only of outsiders, or even primarily of outsiders, but the control of insiders. The whole point of immigration control is to control people for various sorts of ends. But you can't control people outside without controlling people inside. And this is what we see with immigration control everywhere. Because it's not just about border control, about stopping people from entering, but about controlling how people behave, how people act, what things they can do, whether they work, whether they open a bank account, and so on. You can only achieve this by regulating, monitoring, and controlling your own society. So the more seriously you pursue the object of immigration control, the more seriously you'll have to control your own society. And this is something that was recognized very clearly by David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, several years ago, when he said that, well, what we've done, boasting, is we've made it harder to get a driving license, to get a bank account, to get a council house. We've removed more people. All these actions, the internal border matters, as it were, as well as the external border. The point is, if you want to control immigration, you have to control people, which means the controls have to be not just at the boundaries, but internally. Now, this means not only because you will have border guards of all kinds well within the boundaries of the state, and you do. I mean, there are officers who can stop and search and question people within a couple of 100 miles of the US border, within a similar kind of distance within the EU, to check for immigration violations. But it also means that citizens and residents are controlled internally to the extent that you have to have monitoring of universities. I've just been doing some paperwork for university in order to be able to present and be paid at this event. But also it means a certain burden on the university to comply with these regulations. It means the regulation of employers everywhere. It also means the regulation of landlords, for example. In the UK, landlords are now required to check the visa status of any tenant to make sure that they're compliant, or the landlord will be in trouble. But that also means that it's a problem for any potential tenant, because they've got to prove that they're UK citizens, which of course the last thing you're likely to do is have proof if you're a natural-born Briton who's never been out of the country. Here's a statistic that illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. Between 1930 and 2005, the US deported 1 million of its own citizens, obviously by mistake. So you can't deport your own citizens, technically speaking. But 1 million people were deported. Why was this? Well, at various stages in American history in the 20th century, there was a concern that there were too many immigrants. So what did they do? They conducted sweeps in the way that ICE does now to try to find people who were not supposed to be there. And of course, since you can't tell who's an immigrant just by looking, they deported a lot of people who were, in fact, American-born citizens. I picked the figure 1 million in the year 2005 simply because 2005 is the point at which the US reached the 1 million mark, roughly speaking. It's not as if it stopped deporting citizens. It continues to do so. And it's not that the US is unique in this respect either. Australia does it, the UK does it. I'm sure that there are numerous other countries that mistakenly deport their own citizens. So immigration control, I want to suggest, does have this impact on citizens, not just on outsiders. And the reason is you really can't control outsiders without controlling insiders. And this particular statistic gives you a very dramatic sort of illustration of this particular problem. Why should we worry about this? Well, here's one way of thinking about this. If we think about it using what I've called the apartheid analogy, I think we get a particular perspective on this problem, which might be interesting. I'm not doing this because I want to say that the United States or Australia or the UK or any country in Europe is anything like the apartheid regime. But I think the apartheid regime in South Africa in its period between 1944 and 1994 is interesting because the whole policy of apartheid was essentially a program of immigration control. The point of apartheid was to keep people out, to keep the black population from mixing with the white population. But here was the dilemma. While they wanted to keep this part of the population, this part of the continent, out of selected areas, they also wanted the labor force. They wanted the workers, they just didn't want the people. The problem was that the workers were people, and the struggle was to figure out how to deal with this dilemma. Okay? How do we get the labor without taking in the people? The result was a very, very elaborate system of law, which ultimately allowed the people to come in, but required them systematically to move out. Now, you might ask, well, why didn't the black population simply stay out? Why didn't they say, okay, look, we're just going to, you know, not have any association with the white parts of the country and run things ourselves? Well, actually, they sort of did. They decided that they would set up their own farms, they would set up their own industries, and they would go it alone. But this was not really what the white South African regime expected or preferred, because they really wanted the workers. So they imposed taxes, they moved people off more productive land, and made it difficult for them to, in fact, sustain an independent living till they were forced to come back into these white areas to be recruited as foreign labor. In some ways, you might say, not all that different from the world in which we live when we think about other countries which, you know, may want to trade with us, but find that there are obstacles to their doing so. At which point they say, well, in that case, we'll come over and work for you. And at that point, you say, well, we do want you as workers, but we really don't want you to come and live here. There's an interesting kind of parallel here. Now, the consequence of this, however, was that black workers and people started coming in to live in the white areas. And here the problem that the South African government faced was, how do you firstly stop them from really integrating into this society? And how do you stop the white society from itself accepting this transformation? So there are a couple of things that had to be done. Firstly, you had to find institutions to keep the different races apart, which of course presupposed that you could solve an identity problem, which is, how do you distinguish the races? Because, again, it's not actually super obvious how you distinguish between one race and another once you get, for example, people of mixed descent, or once you've got people who look like they might be white or look like they might be black. In fact, what they had to do was they had to set up racial classification boards, because they decided that they couldn't do it on something like a one-drop rule, because too many white South Africans had mixed ancestry. So they tried to do it on appearance, which meant that you had families from, with people of different complexions, finding that one person was classified as white and another person was classified as colored or black. It was a mess. But nonetheless, all of this was the sort of thing that you had to do in order to resolve this particular problem, to keep the races apart. But then the next thing you had to do was to stop the white population from breaking ranks with this particular set of institutions. So you had to start controlling your white population. You had to start requiring they carry passes so that they could be stopped, searched, and examined. You had to now stop the press from reporting anything that was unfavorable to the government, and just doing things that it shouldn't be doing in order to enforce the laws of apartheid. Ultimately, you had to control the courts. So the outcome for South Africa was a kind of transformation of the state into something that was devoted to the ideology of apartheid, to try to make sure that this ideology was something that was embedded in the life and the culture of the society. And the point I want to make out of all of this is that this is nothing really surprising, and it's something that we should be taking note of, thinking about our own society. Because if what you want to do is control immigration and control the interaction and integration of different people, then one of the things you're going to have to do is not just control the outsiders or even control the insiders directly. You're going to have to transform your society into one in which the whole story that lies behind this is one that everyone accepts. And this means transforming not just your policies, but also ultimately your legal and political institutions. Because it's very, very difficult to control immigration just by the exercise of force. There are too many people. To give you an illustration, the US has supposedly about 12 million illegal immigrants, leaving aside the whole question of what exactly is an illegal immigrant, which is not as straightforward as it appears. How do you resolve the problem if indeed it is a problem? One answer is to say, well, let's deport them. Well, right now the US has the capacity to legally deport about 400,000 people a year, using the system of courts and detention centers and judges and lawyers and police officers and so on. Well, if you do the math, it's going to take you about 25 years, assuming that no one else comes in. So if you're going to do this, you're going to have to find some other mechanisms. You're going to have to find ways around the law. You're going to have to find ways of directing the courts and so on, which is what happened. The point I want to make is that this is something that has got to be a concern for any liberal democracy. So this brings me to the next point that I really want to make, and I'm going to make very, very briefly, which is that ultimately immigration control is a concern because it has a bearing on the rule of law. It has a bearing on the extent to which you're able to sustain an equal society. It has a bearing on the extent to which you can have the institutions that we take for granted in a liberal democracy. Because if immigration control is your target, and their target manifests itself, for example, in a view about the numbers of immigrants coming in and the numbers that need to be kept out, then your institutions are going to have to be geared to this particular sort of policy target. But this does not necessarily square with the underlying ethos of these institutions as they stand, because courts of law are not courts or institutions that are set up to produce particular sorts of outcomes. They're produced to dispense justice. They're there in order to attend to disputes, to resolve differences. They aren't set up in order to achieve a determinate policy outcome, to reach a particular policy goal. But if the goal comes to dominate, and you still have these institutions operating, and you want to use these institutions, or at least if you want to respect these institutions, then something's got to give. You've either got to say, well, doing this properly, we simply can't deport 12 million people. It's just not possible. Or you can say, well, deporting those 12 million people is such a priority that something else is going to have to give. And this may be the rule of law. This is why 1 million people were deported in the 20th century, because the target, the policy goal, trumped the institutional structure. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is something that ought to be a very serious concern. It's a concern for any free society which wants to maintain the institutions that make that freedom possible. Well, that said, what about the counter-arguments? Perhaps all of this is true, but immigration control is worth it nonetheless. And maybe we should say, look, we don't want to discount the concerns that I've raised, but there are important things at stake. So there are good reasons nonetheless to try to control immigration, because there are gains to be made by doing so. There are three kinds of reasons I think might be offered. One would be economic reasons. Another would be cultural ones. The third would be reasons to do with self-determination. Let's look at these arguments a bit more closely. I'm going to do this relatively quickly, just given the time frame, but we can explore some of this a little bit more during the Q&A. Well, what about the economic arguments? I think there are two kinds of arguments here, really. One is the argument that says immigration is ultimately bad for us economically because it has a deleterious effect on wealth and income. And the second is that it also disproportionately benefits some people, but at the much greater expense of others. this is why, in one famous book's title, we're coming apart. So let me consider both these arguments, and I'll dispense with the first one fairly quickly, the argument that immigration has a negative effect on a country economically. And I think there's just very, very little evidence for this, and very few people, among economists in particular, think that this is the case. The advantages of a mobile labor force, at least in terms of the overall impact on gross national product or any other kind of measure you want of wealth and income, is almost overwhelmingly positive. And the longer you go into the future, the more positive it becomes. There's very, very little dispute about this. But the second problem is, I think, a more substantial one, and this is that the distribution of those gains is disproportionately in favor of the well-to-do. Cheap Mexican labor comes into the United States. All of those people who want inexpensive labor for agriculture or for tending their lawns do very well, but this cheap labor coming in competes with poorest sectors of the society, and they're the ones who feel the brunt of this, even if the wealthy in the society are doing much, much better because goods and services are cheaper. I think there are a couple of problems with this argument. I think in the end, the evidence doesn't sustain the claim overall, to the extent that it does, and I say this only because all of these debates are somewhat fine-tuned, and so we can always dispute the econometrics, for example. But even if we take the most favorable view to the view most favorable to the advocates of immigration control, there's a very, very small sector of the population that actually does worse in the short to medium term, about maybe 8% of the population. And that doesn't take into account, for example, the fact that a restriction in immigration also has deleterious effects on many of the poorest people in society, because just as some immigrants who come in are laborers whose labor is a substitute for existing labor, many who come in are people whose labor is complementary, in which case they generate more jobs, in which case they also supply an opportunity for others to get employment. So you're looking really at a trade-off between which among the poor you're going to advantage or disadvantage. The other thing that's also worth noting, however, is that this particular argument assumes that what we should do is we should prefer the interests, thinking of it in national terms, protecting people of our own nationality, that we should prefer current nationals to future nationals. So if you take the view that over the long run, everybody benefits, including the future poor, this argument says, well, we should prefer the interests of the current poor over the interests of the future poor. Now, why we should do this is, I think, never explained, but this is something I think that ought to be put into the equation. So I think the distributional argument is, at best, one that needs more work. It's certainly not so powerful an objection, I think, that it overcomes the one or the more general concerns that I advanced in my positive thesis. But what about the cultural argument? And again, I'm going to address this quite quickly. So the cultural argument essentially is one that says we need to control immigration because we need to protect the integrity of our own cultural community. And culture is an important foundation for our own society. And if we let that decline, then we will experience a more general kind of decline, including all the pathologies that come from the conflict that we have with an influx of different people. So here the problem is that if you're going to make this argument, you're going to have to come up with an account of what is the cultural norm in question, which may not be so difficult, perhaps if you're, a small homogeneous society like, let's say, Tibet before the invasion by China. But if you're talking about a moderately diverse society, or very diverse society, such as the United States, or many of the countries of Western Europe, or Australia, or Britain, then it's not so clear that we're going to be able to come up with a definition, or an agreed understanding of what is the common culture. Now, you could, of course, say, well, look, we've got a fairly capacious definition available to us. It's an inclusive culture. But if you say that, then it's hard to know why bringing people in is going to be a problem, because the culture is already diverse. So bringing in others who are also going to be within this diverse society, it's hard to see why that's going to pose a problem. But if you go narrow and say, no, we have a very distinct culture, then you're going to have to settle the question for your own society, because you're going to have to say to some people, well, I'm sorry, you really just don't fit, because our culture is this. In which case, the only outcome of immigration control on this basis will be an internal culture war, squabble over the definition of the existing culture. The other thing I'll note, really more in passing than in depth because of the issue of time, is that one thing that's dominated the history of immigration control for the last several centuries, certainly since the 19th century, is the issue of race. Immigration control is, in part, about controlling who becomes a part of the society. And here the question is, how do you make this determination? Now, if you simply wanted to say, we're just going to exclude people simply to reduce the numbers and nothing else, well, firstly, this is very, very unlikely, because all kinds of people will immediately step up and say, well, but we want an exemption for us because we're employers, or for us because we're Italians and we have lots of Italians who want to come in and join their families. There'll be all kinds of issues. So simply trying to say we're going to do it in terms of numbers is going to be problematic. But if you try to exclude people on the basis of some other kind of categorization, then you've also got a problem. How do you categorize people? And here I simply want to point out that not only has immigration control been racially dominated, it's also the case that immigration has in fact contributed significantly to the development of forms of racial categorization. Because once you discover that you need to control the movement of people, and you decided that you need to control them by distinguishing who can come in and who can't come in, you're going to have to develop all kinds of categories, and these will include racial categories. That's why, for example, in the United States, the issue of whether a man from Syria was black or white or non-white, was in fact an issue. It did lead to another little wrinkle of qualification in the whole system of racial categorization. If you want immigration control, you're going to have to give up something else, which is the idea of a racially non-biased political institution. So let me then turn to one last concern, and that is the idea that what immigration control gives you is self-determination. We need to take our country back. We need to control our borders. We need to control who comes and who goes. I think the biggest problem with this argument and this whole idea is that it suggests that we do actually have this control when we really don't, at least not in the modern world. And the reason for this is that in the modern world, immigration control is not something that we can exercise unilaterally. Here's kind of an obvious reason why we can't do it. Let's say you want to deport some of these 12 million people. Where are you going to deport them to? Let's say Mexico. Why should Mexico take any of these people? Just because you say so? Why don't they deport 12 million people to the United States and say, hey, we think these people are Americans, take them back? Well, of course, you can't do this except through some form of negotiation and discussion and determination bilaterally about who is and who is not an American or a Mexican and so on. But of course, it doesn't stop there. The whole negotiation is a much more complex matter, which involves this very, very complex thing called a border, which is not just a line in the sand or a notional line through the middle of a river. It's actually itself a kind of complex institutional structure, which is governed not even by bilateral treaties between two countries, but by a whole set of international norms, international regimes, by a system of law to which many countries are signatories, but not signatories who, after going into this, retain all the control they had before. They cede control in all kinds of ways. So it's not that self-determination is either 100% or zero. Self-determination is a matter of degree. And the idea that immigration control is going to bring you back some kind of self-determination, I think is a mistake, because controlling immigration is only going to happen through a very, very complicated network of international law to which you have to be subject. Here's another way of looking at this. It's been quite common for people defending immigration control to say, we're taking back our country because ultimately we're a bit like a family. And we get to decide who is or is not a part of the family. Well, do we really decide who comes into the family? Do you decide who your cousin marries, who your children date? There are families like this, but for the most part, actually, the family analogy just doesn't work. Okay? Families are things that grow with the least amount of control. Most members of the family probably will turn out to be, in one sort or another, illegal immigrants. But what about this, another kind of analogy? It's an analogy that says, look, our country is our home, and we get to decide who comes into our home. Well, let me take a look at this particular analogy. It might work if the home in question is a single-person apartment, and you get to decide who comes in and who doesn't come in at any stage, except maybe if it's a fireman who's knocking at the door when the building is burning. But now, if it's a couple, you could have a rule that gave each partner a veto, but this would, I think, make a less than ideal kind of situation if everybody has to ask the other permission. Even more so if you've got a family of, say, 2 people and 3 children, or a group house if you're a bunch of students. If everyone has to get a permission of everybody else, it's going to be a very, very unpleasant kind of place to live in. Now imagine that you extended this to a condominium complex. Does everybody need to get permission from everybody else before they can bring in a cleaner, or before they can have a party or invite someone over? I would think you could, but you won't want to do it. Okay? And the more you extend this, the more implausible it looks, the more likely it is that people will simply break these rules, because it's not a plausible way to live. If that's the case, I think the idea that somehow a nation is a family that's going to be self-determined, or that the nation is a home in which everyone decides who comes in, is simply implausible. It also raises the question, well, actually, where does the authority for all of this come from that says this collective somehow determines what the future of this collective will look like? Many of the writers on immigration appeal to this. David Miller, for example, says this in his book on the political philosophy of immigration. Well, we are a community. We look to the authority of the past, which tells us how we should live now and into the future. But the question is, why does this past have this authority, and who determines what that past is and how this authorization takes place? And I think this is something that the defenders of immigration control have never really considered. Now, in the past, in European history, people have actually considered this, ironically enough. Robert Filmer, for example, examined this question quite carefully and decided that, well, the legitimacy of the president can't be based on any kind of contract. So we've got to trace the origin back in history. But he had a terminating point, which was Adam. Well, that at least makes sense. Okay? The current arguments suggest that we look to the past, but it all starts to get very, very misty. And I suspect that the whole argument for self-determination is an argument that says we should look back into the past and tell some story, and this will be somehow legitimating. But what's unclear is why any of this is legitimating in any sort of way. Of course, it's possible to tell a story, but it's not clear why this particular story should be believed by anybody. Well, I think these are the main arguments that I can think of at any rate, why we might take less seriously the concern that I've advanced about the dangers of immigration control. Perhaps I'll leave it at that and see if you have other objections that are more compelling. Thank you.
I would like to invite you to ask any questions you might think fit. If you want to introduce yourself, I'll take a list here. I'd like to take 2 questions to begin with. So I'll start with Salih.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Salih. I'm a PhD student at the Political Science Department. My question is about civic virtue. If the immigrants or people who are seeking immigration do not share the same civic virtue as citizens of a host country, such as they don't believe in rule of law, they don't support democratic values, they support, even at the extreme levels, they support a Sharia law. They want women to be confined in their household, and they are willing to use the mechanisms available to them for that goal. So isn't that a threat to the host country, to people living in that country, because that directly affects their livelihoods? And shouldn't that be a consideration, serious consideration in that case? Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, Bill Sharp, Political Science. Wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot. So just 2 questions, concerns. Empirically, you're right. Immigration controls pose a real problem for the rule of law. If you look at immigration law in this country, it's riddled with uncertainty, ambiguity, right? But conceptually, I don't think it's that easy, right? So if the rule of law means just a very simple sort of definition, I'll take it from Frederick Hayek, right? Classical liberal, clear perspective, general rules. I can easily think of all sorts of repressive immigration policies. Anyone born, let's say, in the United States in the last year to a non-citizen leaves tomorrow, right? That's the rule of law, according to that kind of minimal definition. So, I think you either have to tell a richer story which shows that is just irrelevant and necessarily, the kind of empirical mess that we see in terms of a lack of legality, immigration law is somehow necessary. But I just don't think conceptually, on its own, the argument has to work, right? And I don't think one doesn't have to be a legal positivist to make this kind of argument either. And the second thing is more about the nature of the argument. So, I guess I'm with you in terms of, let's say, ideal normative liberal theory, right? But as a political intervention, I'm just not sure what it means. Given the fact that it's arguably utopian, maybe unfortunately, that we're going to have, get rid of all immigration controls. So what then do we do, right? What's the fallback position? So I guess I'd be curious what you would have to say in terms of, if one is sympathetic to your argument, I am, in terms of its normative structure, what does this mean here and now in terms of, how can we reform immigration controls, assuming they're going to be around for the next, 50, 100 years, right? Like lots of things we may not like, right? How should we change those to somehow move in the direction you're talking about? But I guess I'm just curious about the normative argumentation, how it relates to contemporary political debates, which seem to me to really be about the nature of immigration controls. Historically, how many places, U.S., yes, there were not, I guess there weren't immigration controls in the 19th century for Europeans, right? But otherwise, so I don't know of too many, this may just be my ignorance, too many places where there haven't been some sort of immigration controls, right? Unfortunately, maybe, but, But thanks, yeah.
Why don't you?
Okay, so let me address those questions first. So firstly, on the rule of law, you're absolutely right that a simplistic or very, very plain definition of the rule of law simply won't work. And I think it's actually also, it's not a plausible understanding of the rule of law, which just says, we have the law and then we apply it. And in the book, in the chapter on equality in the rule of law, I spend quite a lot of time talking about the rule of law as a political ideal. So it has to be understood as something with some sort of ethical content. And it's not simply the case that if the law exists and is applied, then the rule of law obtains, because the rule of law is a kind of normative ideal. And a part of that normative ideal, of course, is that there is an institutional structure in which there are courts and judges, officers of all kinds, who are themselves given certain sorts of powers and authority and understandings about how it is that you do justice when you're applying the law. In which case, one thing that will be very, very evident is that simply taking the law and applying it without reflection on a particular case will be inconsistent with the ideal of the rule of law, because every case is different. You have to look at the case. I think one of the troubling things about immigration control, and a lot of this comes as a result of the transformation of refugee law, is that more and more countries, particularly Australia in this case, have tried to craft legislation that essentially binds the courts, so that judges have less and less discretion when it comes to dealing with, for example, refugee cases. And this seems to me entirely inconsistent with the rule of law, because now it means that judges can't actually do anything that involves judging. It's almost getting to the point where they will become unnecessary. But it seems to me that if you had certain institutions in which there was no room for this kind of interrogation of a case before making a determination, then the rule of law is at an end. It's still ruled by the law, but that's not consistent with the rule of law. So I completely accept that at that point and try to address it in more detail elsewhere. On your broader point about the nature of this intervention and where this leads, in this I haven't made an argument for anything. I haven't made an argument that says we should have no immigration control. I haven't made an argument for open borders, for example, which I had originally set out to say, okay, what we want is open borders. And one of the things I concluded after working this for a while is that actually even the notion of an open border was actually completely under-theorized. What exactly is an open border? Because it's not a binary, right? Borders are not either open or closed, it's a matter of degree. And in the longer version of this talk, I spent quite a bit of time talking about what is an open border, because a border could be open in the sense that you can easily cross it, but closed to the extent that even when you crossed it, you can't do anything, you can't work, you can't buy a house, you can't rent. Okay? So you could open up a border not by adding any more people or admitting any more people. You can open the border by changing other regulations. But I haven't made an argument to say, well, so here's the outcome that we should be looking for. I'm simply trying to say that the more you press in this direction of immigration control, the more you're going to create this sort of a problem. Okay? I'm not trying to give you an account of where we should stop. I'm not trying to say we should have zero immigration control, because it's simply not plausible in the modern world. We live in a world where there are laws, there are treaties, there are all kinds of institutions. But I am saying that if we keep going down this path, there is this following danger. My preference is therefore to move in the other direction, less immigration control. And part of the book tries to say why various concerns are not as important as people think, but they still don't lead to a determinate outcome. So to the extent that this is an intervention in the contemporary debate, it's basically casting a skeptical eye on a whole range of arguments and say, here's something you haven't considered. So on the question of what one does about immigrants who might have views which are somehow viewed as a danger or a threat to existing values, think there are a couple of answers here. When anybody comes into a country, you could say, well, how do we know that this is not going to cause a problem? Every tourist is a potential danger. So the question is, how seriously do we take this? Okay? And I think for the most part, when it comes to tourism, we apply very, very, very low standards. Okay? If you've got a credit card, and and we don't even check too closely if you've got a criminal conviction, you can come in. Okay? So the question then really is about, okay, what about people coming in to settle in some more substantial way? Well, we're still not doing an awful lot to address the kinds of dangers that you're talking about, if they are indeed dangers, because people can still come in with those sorts of attitudes and views and so on in all kinds of ways. One obvious way is by birth, and therefore inculcated into a kind of tradition which is inconsistent with the majority view. If there are differential birth rates, when people have particular ideologies, this could be a problem. I want to say, it's not that you should say that this could never be a problem. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it, but I think you've also got to ask, well, what is the extent to which you want to exercise control in order to prevent certain sorts of, let's call them pathologies from arising. And I'm someone who thinks that within a liberal democracy, what you say is, well, we take the risk, and secondly, we use persuasion rather than force in order to address the problem. Moreover, there are all kinds of ways to address this issue besides the very, very blunt instrument of immigration control. For all kinds of reasons. I mean, one reason most obviously is that if the immigration control is your main tool for this, the last thing people are going to tell you about when they move into a society is exactly what it is that they think and what it is that they're planning to do. When you mention the case of Sharia law, this actually maybe is an interesting case. I mean, most of Sharia law is not about the more dramatic things that people think about. Most of it is actually very, very practical in terms of systems of law. And it operates in all kinds of countries simultaneously with Western law, let's say English common law. It operates in Malaysia, for example, in other parts of Asia. So I don't think the example is one that is particularly a telling one from my point of view. But maybe there are others that that are more pertinent.
Thank you. We have a second set of two questions. Hong Yu.
My name is Huang Zhao. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Political Science here. My question may be related to the last part of your presentation, the political justification for immigration or border control. That is thinking about this problem through the lens of property rights, like maybe the right to control immigration of foreigners is derived from the right of property by regarding the territory of a country as a property of this community. So in that sense, the community can deal with the foreigners, deal with whether they want them in or out based on their property right. Maybe I have a second question. As you said, you are not clearly make a positive argument for certain things. I'm asking about what's your view on the cosmopolitan framework of politics, like every human being have a right to settle, to live, to be a citizen of any particular community.
Thank you. Has?
Thank you. Has Benai, Department of International Studies. Wonderful talk. Very excited to read the book. I suppose my question also was about the kind of the positive argument. You had the title, in your title, the term freedom, and it came up very little. So I want to kind of ask about that a little bit, because I feel like in a significant way, the project in a way questions the very authority of the state. In a way, state is about membership at the end of the day and defining what authority, what legitimate basis for the exercise of coercive authority a state might have. And it felt to me that this was, in a way, a kind of a rethink of the 90s era turn in political theory about multicultural citizenship, that the state ought to apply, especially liberal democratic states, have to have very good basis for applying democratic ideals to when thinking about the terms of membership and the acceptance of new members in liberal democratic societies. Is that the ideal, perhaps the ideal objection that one could think about, that there are ideal objections to, or idealist objections to the authority of the state, not purely self-determination, but the democratic character of a state, might be significantly undermined if we do away, or if we question, or take away the imperative for control altogether. Another way to put this is that if immigration is fundamentally about the movement of people, or this problem is about how to deal with the movement of interest and identity-bearing human beings, would an objection that a democratic way of deciding what the terms of membership might be is in fact a very kind of a salutary way of deciding what the terms of membership might be, that the focus on control might otherwise strip away or undermine significantly, and allow for more kind of authoritarian alternatives to take root. So in a way, where does this fit in that kind of multicultural citizenship membership argument? Because it seemed like that had been established as a standard for thinking about membership in a way that would also account for equitable freedom.
Okay. So let me start with the question of property and territory. So I don't think that we can think about territory as property. It's not that the United States is a single political community that owns the United States collectively in the same way that, say, I might own my apartment, or I might own my house. Now, a part of the reason for this, and I'm going to have to skate very, very quickly here, is that it's not as if property is actually a straightforward notion either. Okay, it's not that there is just one kind of form of property. To own property does not mean that you have its land, say, just fee simple property, that you own it and do whatever you like. Property comes in all kinds of forms. A lot of property is, for example, leasehold property. Much of landed property is property that comes with liens, or comes with all kinds of qualifications that limit the kinds of rights you have. Every kind of property right is a complex bundle of different kinds of rights, and these vary from state to state, from society to society, from nation to nation. Okay? So when you think about a national territory, it really has almost nothing to do with property, even though governments can also themselves own property and can dispose of property and can nationalize property. So to think about nationality, or rather the national territory and property as somehow linked in some way, I think is just it's just a mistake. So we should think about territory and territorial rights as something that's much more closely tied to another complicated notion, which is a notion of sovereignty. That gets us into a whole different sort of argument. So just remind me what the second question was you had.
Cosmopolitan regime.
About cosmopolitan ideals. I mean, I speak as a frequent flyer, so I'm kind of a citizen of everywhere and nowhere, having been born in Malaysia, become an Australian citizen, living in the United Kingdom, and possibly who knows where I'll be next. But there are other people who have much more particular attachments, which are then national identity attachments. Some of them have even more particular ones, which are some people feel that it's more important that they're Texan than that they're American. And there are some people for whom the local community is even more important. I don't think any of what I've said has a bearing on this. You could accept the arguments that I've made and say, I'm a cosmopolitan. You can also accept it and say, but I still believe in the importance of local community. I don't think it bears on the immigration issue, unless you want to make an argument to say that we are a national community and this is the entity that needs to be protected. And then it's not really an issue of cosmopolitan, because the larger the entity in question, the more likely it is that the overall ethos will be a cosmopolitan one, even though it might have pockets of non-cosmopolitan, sort of local or parochial ways of thinking. But once again, the kinds of arguments you can make to say that we all must share this common cosmopolitan ethos would be difficult to sustain, given the kind of diversity that we see in a modern liberal democratic society. On the question of how this fits in with sort of 90s style debates about multiculturalism, I'd like to ask you to explain a little bit more. What is the what's the kind of core question that you're asking me to answer, so I don't just ramble on about the history of the 1990s.
No, I'm glad, because I was actually hoping for a second chance, because I suppose what I'm asking is there a difference between democratic and non-democratic immigration control? And does the latter have a good defense or a good ideals-based objection to doing away with that, with immigration control?
Okay, but as I said, I'm not making an argument for doing away with immigration controls. But what I'm trying to say is, obviously, it's not an either-or problem of immigration controls or open borders. It's not. What we have is a continuum. A continuum. What I'm trying to argue is that the more you exercise this power to control immigration, whether it's democratically sourced or comes from a particular political elite, whichever the source, the more you pursue that control as an end to produce particular outcomes, for example, for reducing the numbers, increasing the numbers, changing the composition, the more you pursue this, the more extensively you have to control your own citizens. And from the point of view of someone who's interested in, say, democratic citizenship, self-governance, and so on, to me the kind of key question is, why would you think that increasing the level of control exercised over citizens themselves, increased surveillance, monitoring, etc., is any kind of form of self-governance, of let alone democratic self-government? I mean, I didn't go through all of this in a lot of detail, simply because there is a lot of detail. But the institutions of citizen control are now very, very extensive. I mean, just think about the most trivial forms in which you are now subject to this when you enter an airport. But you consider more broadly all the kinds of reporting requirements that, let's say, universities are subject to in order to bring in a speaker, admit a student. All of these things are increasingly forms of control that are things that people are subject to. One argument I've often heard is that, well, so what's the difference? What's immigration control in a society that's already full of these sorts of controls? And my general response to this is to say, well, this is the worry, that the more controls that we're subject to, the more likely we are to say, well, what's one more? Okay? And I want to say, maybe it's at this point that we should start thinking about how we push back on this, because, as Sir David Hume once said, it's seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. So again, it's not an argument to say, here's where we need to get to. It's an argument to say, here's where we're going, and we should pause and think about the outcomes here.
Okay, team, and then the gentleman back there.
Tim Waters from the law school. So just to start, the one thing I did like about the presentation.
Oh, sorry, no, go ahead. I'll just make
Rafael is on the list. So.
This point you made that when we're talking about this, we need to think about the territory rather than the border. I mean, this is an obvious point, but you're quite right. It's an obvious point that is almost always ignored. So I think that was quite useful. And I agree that it's sort of true that the more we engage in immigration controls, the more we are limiting our freedoms in theory. I think the problem I have, and something that Bill said as well, I mean, this is conceptually true in isolation, but it's also true that that's always true in all contexts. This is not the source of control alone. Most of the controls that you're talking about happen for other reasons anyway, and so it's not clear that dealing with this question is going to address that larger tension between governance and freedom. And this makes me to the thing I thought was interesting. I like the point as well about stressing that citizenship, migration, these are not natural categories. This again is a very true but overlooked point. I would encourage you to apply it more uniformly, because I saw a lot of the argument being driven by sort of casual assumptions of naturalness in other places that you didn't address. And just to give a couple examples, you mentioned the idea of the large-scale citizen deportation in the U.S. Your other examples were the UK and Australia. Well, this is not a random set of countries, right? These come from a particular tradition, and these are countries that don't have ID cards. Now ID cards are not, they're a kind of control, but they're not inconsistent with liberal freedoms. Many decent societies have them. And those countries, I don't have the stats right with me, but I'm quite sure of it, as from my previous work, they don't have the same problem in the same way about accidental deportation, because they are able to control this in a way that doesn't happen in post-English societies. Likewise, two other examples, the deportation processes. It's true, we can't really crank out 12 million deportations quickly. I'm kind of glad that's true. But it's not, I don't think, true that those are like the correct rule of law processes. They can be moved up or down. I think you can tell a very plausible story that in fact they are, in a sense, willfully dysfunctional, because half of our very dysfunctional immigration debate is about slowing this down as much as possible. But they don't describe a natural state of correct natural deportation either. And lastly, asylum norms. These, in fact, I think, if anything, a plausible reading of international law on asylum would actually suggest we live in a much more brutal sovereigntist world. The existing, again, non-natural rules actually would give the United States or any other country enormous leeway to do much more than they're doing. I don't think it's fair to describe them as constraining us. In fact, that's mostly a kind of gloss that is placed upon it that can only be read by squinting. These are very harsh rules that give most of the power to the states to do things like determine this entire caravan that's coming. Almost surely 0 people in there have a valid claim once we go through the process, because they've already been offered asylum in Mexico. It's really over. There's many reasons why things like that, if you applied the international rules, would actually lead to much harsher regime. The last thing I just want to say, and this is something that Bill mentioned as well, so the question of freedom, it feels like you're proving too much, in the sense that self-government is never free. It's about tying yourself to the mast. It's about constraining yourself. I take it everyone from Hobbes and Locke to today has said that. But you're seeming to describe it, I had the exact same intuition. It sounded like your thesis was leading to immigration non-control. And then to pull back and say it's not that, I mean, that seems to be where it's leading. So I would just close with this thought. It seems to me there's a kind of tragic paradox in here. If you're right, constrain our internal immigration control, I think there's a real tragic trade-off that you at least want to address. I think it was something like Schengen. If you want to have a freer internal space, you're going to have less free borders. You're going to have higher walls. That's probably the trade-off. The more freedom inside, the harsher the regime is going to be on the frontier. So, question mark.
Excellent. Can you take one more question?
Yeah. Come on, he asked 10 questions. Let
I just asked. You want to answer? Because I want to. Yeah.
My name is Leonid Polishuk. I'm a panelist visiting this workshop from Uppsala University in Sweden. You mentioned briefly some economic arguments against immigration, and briefly dismissed them, and rightly so. You argued that immigrants most of the time make positive contribution to economic growth, which is a firmly established established task, and he said that distributional concerns are not as great as they appear to be. But there are also some possible implications of migration, immigration, for the public sector. And I'm not talking about the burden that migrants would arguably present on social safety nets, welfare programs, so on and so forth. I think these concerns are also exaggerated. What I'm talking about is about cultural diversity, something that someone mentioned before, which can translate into political preference diversity. People might have very different political preferences, not necessarily about the role of women, Sharia law, and otherwise, but about more mundane issues such as redistribution, the scope of government, what governments do, what governments do not do. And if a society is very sharply politically polarized and divided, it's very difficult to find political middle ground in that society. And that presents serious problems for democracy, because if a median voter decides what the government should do, that would leave a majority of people on either side of this median quite unhappy with what the government does. And we clearly see here in the United States. And you could argue that many countries are already deeply polarized politically. That might be a part of the answer, which I'm not trying to preempt. But perhaps it's a good idea not to make matters worse. And apart from democracy being not particularly satisfactory polarized society for different parts of the society, democracy can become unstable, and government performance can suffer in cultural polarized societies. And there is a lot of empirical evidence suggesting that in societies which have high degrees of ethno-linguistic polarization, governance is usually quite a bit weaker than it would have been otherwise. And lastly, if a society is culturally divided and polarized along ethnic lines, you observe a lack of cohesion in this society, and people's communication with each other, social networks, so on and so forth, which are important support to democracy, gets polarized as well. And this is also something that is supported empirically. So I'd be interested to hear your response to these concerns as well.
So let me take your questions first. So I did skate very quickly over the economic arguments, and I did, in particular, didn't say anything at all about the economic arguments, about the impact of immigration on the public sector. And I do say quite a lot about this in the book. The economics chapter is one of the largest chapters, although it's probably the least original, because I basically go through the literature. So I'm not going to try to give a more sophisticated response to this, but I want to focus much more on the second kind of concern that you've got, which is the kind of cultural concern with the impact of immigration. And I think, again, I've only got a little bit of time, obviously, because there is another question to address, but I guess that the one thing I would draw attention to is that, while we have all of these arguments about the cultural impact of the movement of different kinds of people and how it might transform a society and have this and that consequence, immigration policy doesn't actually reflect this concern, even when governments say that this might be a reason, because the process of taking people in, making them permanent residents, and then ultimately making them citizens, actually takes almost no notice of any of this. I mean, mostly when people come in as immigrants, it's because they've come in because they've got work visas. And when you get a work visa, it's not the case that whether you're coming from Moldova or Australia, that they're going to interrogate you about your cultural values. They're really going to look at your qualifications. And then over the 5 years, get permanent residence and ultimately citizenship. The test is not, look, we want to really look very, very closely at your background and find out whether you're going to be someone who fits in. We're going to take it simply that actually, if you've not been arrested and you've been a decent citizen and you've paid your taxes, you can stay. So for all of these arguments that are out there about the importance of this very, very subtle concern, I would say there's no government in the world that actually takes this seriously, in its practice. They may say we need to preserve our cultural integrity, but actually, if they need more doctors, they'll get them from the Philippines or India because they need the doctors, and they'll worry about this later. Now, one question you might say is, well, look, is this storing up trouble for the future? I would say for the most part it's not, because there's very, very little evidence anywhere that it's that it's creating the extent of the problem that people are concerned about. It's not that there aren't tensions within societies of all kinds, cultural and nationalistic and others. But if you take a brief history of the UK from, say, over the last 100 years, you'll see that the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh have been fighting the English for all of this history. And the Scots, I think, still really just don't like the English that much. But I don't think this is the source of the problem. It's not this cultural tension that's the source of the problem for the UK. It's not to say that it's not a problem, but I'm not sure that it's the kind of existential problem that people are making out to be. And once again, if you have immigration control, and I'm not saying you should have zero, you may well have control that does exclude some people for very, very obvious reasons of criminality. But beyond that, I'm not sure that we either have the mechanisms or the incentives or the practice of excluding on that basis. So if we're going to take this this concern really seriously, I just wonder how we would actually go about it. And that's even leaving aside for the moment the fact that there are very, very different people already within a society who might still be having children and so on. To the other set of questions, it's not going to be easy to distill it into a kind of single thread. But maybe what I'll do is say take the argument about my having criticized the definition of immigrant nationality as non-naturalistic, but then not taken notice of a whole range of other things, which I seem to have addressed as if there are kinds of natural practices out there that I'm just taking for granted. Now, I don't think that I'm doing this because I think when I've given these other examples, I'm not trying to imply or assume that all of these different ways in which governments have managed things are somehow simply be taken at face value, because all of these also have a very, very complex and diverse history, some of which I go into in some detail in the book, some of which I simply can't. Let me take as an example, though, the case of refugee and asylum seeker law, which might be just a useful way of illustrating this. Once again, it's not that there's a kind of natural norm that's always existed. In fact, what there is a very, very complex regime that's grown up over the last 60 or so years since the International Refugee Convention in 1951. This is something that was set up in the wake of the Second World War, which itself came about sometime after the first attempts to develop a form of refugee law to cope with refugee movements during the First World War. All of these laws that have emerged everywhere have been a kind of response to particular sorts of problems, and they've all, as a result, acquired their own peculiarities and pathologies and so on. I think what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years is an even greater transformation of this particular body of law, partly as a result of the transformation of attitudes towards immigration more generally. I mean, here's one way in which it's had a serious problem to confront. As immigration has become more and more difficult for people, the temptation to find a legal route through refugee law grows greater and greater in a time when you could move without much hindrance, because, let's say lots of people who fled Nazi Germany did so before they were persecuted. They were anticipatory refugees, but they could do so because it was easy. Now they'd have to go down this route. But then lots of other people who are anticipating persecution also want to go this route. This clogs up this whole structure. This leads to all kinds of other interventions then by the state, which says, okay, we've got to control this because there are all these people who are not really, proper candidates and so on. So this leads to, among other things, demands for identity cards, which Australia saw in the 1980s. It was abandoned. All of these things, I think, I fully recognize are not anything natural. They're all a consequence of political pressures, institutional changes that are themselves the result of changing historical circumstances. I guess I just want to say to you this: the story I'm trying to tell is not trying to keep one kind of thing constant, as if this is just the way of the world, and then there's all this other stuff which is the intervention that I'm decrying. I'm just taking one slice of a bigger kind of pie, and that pie is, if you like, more broadly, political life. Okay, and I'm saying, okay, here's one thing that people think they're very clear on in some respects, and I'm going to say, actually, it's not. Here's the problem. But I fully accept that there are lots of things that have to be said about other aspects of political life. One thing I will say I haven't said much about in this talk is actually what I mean by freedom. And it's not because I have nothing to say about this, but because I've got too much to say about this. So the last chapter of the book is entirely about that, but maybe on that topic you'll have to buy the book.
That's good. There are 3 people on the queue, so I just want to give them a chance just to make their points, and you don't have to answer, but Raphael, gentleman, and so just for the sake of the conversation, but we are almost past our time.
So I am Raphael Mathia from PhD student from the law school, and I wanted to go back to that question of self-determination that you put out as whether that serves as an objection, and I guess my concern is more, from a conceptual standpoint, whether that relationship between immigration controls and self-determination, and I guess it's more not so much about whether immigration controls are necessary for keeping one particular self without not sort of like changing or being modified by outside influence, but more about the very possibility of self-determination, in the sense that precisely because I agree with you that there's not necessarily a natural, definition of what the collective is in a particular society or something like that, or there's no, the traits of belonging to the society are not natural, but are more like somewhat of a construct and are contingent in the sense that they have like changed throughout history and throughout different societies. So if in the absence of some actual norms that define who gets to belong and who doesn't, and who gets to participate in political decision making and who doesn't, wouldn't that sort of like blur the boundaries of the collective and make it so that self-determination becomes difficult, at least procedurally democratic self-determination? If I, as a foreign student here, for example, who have been living here for 6 years, can decide that I've been here long enough that I should be entitled to be a citizen of the United States and participate in its democratic processes, and there's no control of it, then all of a sudden, it's hard to see what, like if I participate in democratic voting, for example, and there's no control about it, then it's democratic self-determination becomes more difficult. And I think it's even more so now in sort of like globalized wars, where even like territorial borders may not be that relevant in the sense that I can be somewhere else and decide that I have enough of a stake in the United States or enough of a connection to be considered a U.S. citizen and participate in elections. So I guess that idea, and I guess that ties into Professor Waters' question about the, in the end, does some sort of enforceability, like the enforceable immigration controls maybe serve something more than just to restrict freedom, but are also necessary for, kind of like a precondition for democratic decision making to some extent.
I'd like to just quickly make.
Let me start with an anecdote. I was in France a year or two ago, and I was wearing a backpack that said I had fun at Kobe's bar mitzvah, and I had a big Jewish star on it. And someone came over and said I should take it off for my own safety. And I guess it's being suggested to me that the increase in anti-Semitism in France corresponds to the increase in immigration from Muslims, at least from Muslims from certain countries. And if we posit that to be the case, that they're above average anti-Semitic, it is perfectly rational for Jews to oppose immigration from Muslims from certain countries who could be reasonably predicted to be above average anti-Semitic. And if you're a partisan of liberal democracy, you see anti-Semitism as a canary in the mine, you might also oppose immigration of the above average anti-Semitic group.
Let me take this last call. Sorry.
Just one more, and then we'll have to.
I'll be very quick. Nick Snowden in the economics department. I'm just wondering the importance of polycentric governance. For immigration, do we want more forms so that we get almost like a Tebow effect of competition between different governances? Would that help or not?
Thank you.
Yeah. So quickly on the last one, I'm very interested in the whole question of polycentric government. The short answer is I don't know. That's a kind of empirical question, and while I'm sympathetic to it, I really don't have a good answer. On the question of whether it might be rational for rich people to oppose immigration if there's if there's evidence that more Muslims means more anti-Semitism, I think it's a very dangerous path to go down. I mean, that means you would say, okay, look, if we have people from Africa coming in, we know they have certain characteristics, and this is going to raise the probability of X. So we're going to treat them as a single block. They're in the category of Africans, or they're going to treat them they're in the category of Muslims, or even we're going to say we're going to identify people as the category Jewish, and we're going to take them as a kind of homogeneous category. I think it's a very dangerous path to go down, and I would really resist it, even though there are ways of finding bits of evidence that will favor one sort of policy or another if you categorize people in this way. I think categorizing people is something one should be very, very wary of. On the question of self-determination, I guess I'll say just very quickly that the whole point of what I've wanted to do in my chapter on self-determination and in this talk is in fact to complexify it rather than simplify it. My concern is, it's not, I don't want to be too rude to the advocates of self-determination and say that they're all simple-minded, but I think there are things in it that they've assumed that have taken a too simplistic view of self-determination, and in particular, I think many of the accounts have elided those aspects of it that are problematic and focused on the things that are to the advantage of their arguments. So I'm perfectly sympathetic to your attempt to make this a more complicated notion, but I think the more complicated we see self-determination to be, the harder it is to make a clean argument on the basis of self-determination for a whole range of policies, including immigration control.
We have passed our time. Thank you, Chandran, for a wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for being with us.
Yeah.